Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1897, the Kentucky Herald printed a brief notice about a missing physician in Harlan County, deep in the eastern Kentucky highlands. The article, barely 4 paragraphs long, mentioned that local authorities had been called to investigate the disappearance of Dr. William Hargrove, a traveling physician last seen heading toward an isolated homestead during a severe snowstorm. The newspaper reported that a search party had recovered the doctor's horse wandering the mountain roads, but found no trace of Hargrove himself. The article concluded by noting that the harsh weather had forced the search to be suspended temporarily. What the newspaper failed to mention was that this brief report would mark the beginning of one of the most horrifying cases in Appalachian history, one that would remain largely undocumented for decades. Dr. Hargrove had reportedly sought shelter at the Thornhill Place, a modest cabin situated on a remote hillside approximately 12 miles from the nearest settlement. The homestead was occupied by the Thornhill twins, Marie and Margaret, 17-year-old girls who had lived alone since their parents' deaths from influenza 2 years prior. According to county records recovered during a courthouse renovation in 1956, the twins had been permitted to remain on their family property despite their youth, an arrangement not uncommon in the isolated mountain communities where self-sufficiency was both necessary and expected. The disappearance of a respected physician would eventually lead investigators to uncover evidence of horrors that no one in the peaceful mountain community could have imagined. Through fragmented personal journals, county archives, newspaper accounts, and court records, we can now piece together the chilling story of the Thornhill twins and the terror they inflicted upon unwary travelers who sought shelter from the unforgiving mountain wilderness. The Thornhill family first appears in Harlan County records in September 1884, when James Thornhill purchased a remote 30-acre property in the eastern Kentucky highlands. The deed of sale, preserved in county archives, describes the land as heavily wooded with limited agricultural potential, situated between 2 steep ridge lines approximately 12 miles from the nearest settlement of Pine Fork. Tax records indicate that James paid in cash, an unusual circumstance noted by the county clerk. The family arrived from Virginia, though specific details of their previous residence remain unclear. James and Eleanor Thornhill brought with them identical twin daughters, Marie and Margaret, born in 1880, and thus already 6 years old upon their arrival in Kentucky. Neighbors interviewed decades later described the family as reserved but cordial when encountered. James would venture into Pine Fork monthly for supplies and occasional social interaction, while Eleanor and the girls remained largely unseen beyond the boundaries of their property. This seclusion was not particularly remarkable in the isolated mountain communities, where homesteads could be miles apart and self-sufficiency was both valued and necessary. School attendance records, from 1,886 to 1,888, show that the twins attended the local one-room schoolhouse sporadically for approximately 2 years before their father informed the county that they would henceforth be educated at home. Their teacher, Miss Sarah Holloway, kept personal notes about her students, discovered among her effects after her death in 1922. Her observations of the Thornhill girls described them as unusually bright but troublingly synchronized in speech and behavior, often completing each other's sentences or speaking in unison without apparent coordination. Most concerning to Miss Holloway was the twins' habit of whispering to each other in what she described as a private language, incomprehensible to others, falling silent whenever adults approached. Following the deaths of James and Eleanor Thornhill from influenza in the winter of 1895, the now 15-year-old twins remained on the property alone. Local residents, hardened by the realities of mountain life where orphaned teenagers often had little choice but to fend for themselves, thought little of this arrangement. Neighbors would occasionally check on the girls, but largely left them to their own devices, noting that they seemed capable of maintaining their modest homestead without assistance. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood's initial investigation into Dr. Hargrove's disappearance was perfunctory at best, as documented in his official report filed with the county clerk on the 17th of February, 1897. Blackwood and 3 deputies spent 2 days searching the most obvious routes between Pine Fork and the doctor's intended destination of Cumberland Gap, focusing primarily on ravines and steep embankments where a traveler might have fallen during the blizzard. Finding no body, Blackwood concluded that the physician had likely become disoriented in the whiteout conditions, wandered from the main trail, and perished in the vast wilderness. His remains perhaps disturbed by scavenging animals. Such explanations were readily accepted in a region where the harsh mountain landscape claimed several lives each winter. The matter might have faded entirely from official concern if not for the observant nature of Samuel Layton, who had served as postal carrier for the eastern portion of Harlan County since 1892. Layton maintained a personal journal of his weekly route, noting weather conditions, road status, and brief mentions of travelers he encountered along the way. This journal, discovered among his possessions after his death in 1921, provides crucial documentation of a disturbing pattern that emerged in the months following Dr. Hargrove's disappearance. In March 1897, Layton recorded a conversation with a peddler named Jacob Finley, who mentioned plans to travel the Pine Fork Road past the Thornhill property. Layton noted 2 weeks later that Finley had never arrived at his expected destination in Cumberland Gap. Similarly, in early April, his journal mentions meeting a circuit preacher, Reverend Thomas Williams, who intended to visit isolated homesteads including the Thornhill place. The Reverend's horse and wagon were discovered abandoned near a creek crossing approximately 5 miles beyond the Thornhill property, but the man himself was never found. By late May, Layton noted with growing concern the disappearance of a young man named Daniel Cooper, who had been traveling to meet his fiancée in Pine Fork but never arrived. Layton wrote, "Cooper told me he might seek shelter at the Thornhill place if the weather worsened. This makes 3 travelers gone missing along the same stretch of road since winter." Each time, the explanation seems reasonable enough in isolation, but taken together, I cannot help but wonder if something more sinister is occurring near the twin girls' cabin. The eastern Kentucky highlands, at the close of the 19th century, comprised a world unto itself, a landscape of steep wooded slopes, narrow valleys, and scattered homesteads connected by primitive roads that often became impassable during severe weather. The people who inhabited this challenging terrain had developed over generations a culture of fierce independence and self-reliance born of necessity. Historical records from the period reveal communities where neighbors might live miles apart, seeing each other only occasionally at church gatherings, general stores, or seasonal events like barn raisings and harvest celebrations. This isolation fostered both remarkable self-sufficiency and a deep-rooted reluctance to interfere in others' private affairs. County records from 1897 show that Sheriff Blackwood's jurisdiction covered approximately 480 square miles of mountainous terrain, with only 2 deputies to assist him. Law enforcement typically concentrated on the larger settlements, venturing into the remote hollows and ridges only when specifically called upon. Many disputes and even crimes were handled informally within communities, without official involvement. A Methodist circuit rider's journal, from 1896 notes, "The mountain folk solve their own troubles and guard their privacy with a zeal approaching religious devotion. Questions about family matters are met with polite but firm deflection." This cultural context explains why 2 teenage girls living alone after their parents' deaths raised few concerns among neighbors or authorities. Such arrangements, while unusual, fell within the boundaries of the community's values regarding self-determination and privacy. The period also marked the beginning of significant change in the region, as coal companies began establishing operations in previously untouched areas. Company records from the Cumberland Coal Corporation show that by 1897, survey teams were active throughout eastern Kentucky, mapping potential mining sites and planning rail lines. This influx of outsiders created new traffic patterns through formerly isolated regions and brought tension between traditional mountain communities and representatives of the industrializing world. The changing landscape inadvertently illuminated the Thornhill twins' activities, as increasing numbers of travelers passing near their property meant more potential victims and, eventually, more noticeable disappearances. As one local historian later wrote, The mountains had always kept secrets well, but as the outside world pushed inward, even the darkest corners were eventually exposed to light. By October 1897, Samuel Layton's journal entries show increasing preoccupation with the disappearances along his route. On October 12th, he finally brought his compiled observations to Sheriff Blackwood's office in Harlan. According to the sheriff's daily log, preserved in county archives, Blackwood initially dismissed the postal carrier's concerns as overactive imagination fueled by mountain superstition. The sheriff's attitude shifted, however, when Layton produced his meticulously detailed records, showing that at least 6 travelers over the preceding 8 months had mentioned intentions to pass by or seek shelter at the Thornhill cabin during inclement weather, only to vanish without trace. Blackwood's subsequent inquiries, documented in reports filed in November 1897, revealed that the Thornhill twins had established something of a reputation among regular travelers through the region. They had begun offering meals and occasional overnight lodging to those passing by their remote cabin, a practice that had apparently started shortly after their parents' deaths. This hospitality raised questions about how 2 young women managed to support themselves in such isolation. Their property included only a small garden plot insufficient to produce substantial surplus for trade, and they owned no livestock beyond a few chickens. Martha Collins, proprietress of the general store in Pine Fork, provided significant information during an interview with Blackwood on November 15th. Her ledger showed that the Thornhill girls purchased unusual quantities of salt, various preserving agents, and specific herbs with known meat-preserving properties. Conspicuously absent from their regular purchases were substantial food items or fresh meat, despite their reported practice of feeding travelers. Collins noted that the twins always paid in mixed coinage rather than local scrip or barter, unusual for mountain residents of limited means. When Sheriff Blackwood casually questioned Margaret Thornhill during a seemingly coincidental encounter at the general store, she explained with apparent openness that travelers often compensated them for hospitality with small amounts of money or trade goods, allowing them to maintain their independent lifestyle. The sheriff noted in his report that the girl's explanation seemed plausible enough, delivered with unwavering eye contact and a gentle smile that belied her youth. Nevertheless, he concluded his notes with an observation that would prove darkly prescient. Something about the Thornhill situation doesn't sit right. The math of their existence doesn't add up. The Cumberland Valley Railroad Company's expansion plans brought Edward Hutchinson and his 3-man survey team to Harlan County in early April 1898. Company records indicate the team's assignment was to map potential rail routes through previously uncharted mountain passes between Pine Fork and Cumberland Gap. Hutchinson, a 35-year-old engineer with extensive experience in difficult terrain, maintained detailed field notes of his progress. His final entry, dated April 17, 1898, mentions plans to survey the narrow valley adjacent to the Thornhill property, noting that the resident twin sisters offered water and shelter should weather deteriorate. When Hutchinson failed to rejoin his team at their predetermined meeting point on April 19th, his assistants conducted a preliminary search before reporting his absence to both their employers and Sheriff Blackwood. Unlike previous disappearances, this one involved a well-connected company employee with superiors who demanded action. The Cumberland Valley Railroad's regional director, Jonathan Mercer, sent a strongly worded telegraph to the county judge insisting on a thorough investigation, which the judge then instructed Blackwood to provide. The sheriff's daily log shows his reluctance, describing the search as likely fruitless given the vastness of the territory and the time elapsed, but he nevertheless assembled a search party of 12 men on April 22nd. Their efforts focused on the area around the Thornhill property, where Hutchinson was last known to be working. Though they found no trace of the surveyor himself, one of his assistants, William Porter, discovered a leather case containing precision instruments partially concealed beneath a fallen log in a ravine approximately 200 yards from the Thornhill cabin. Sheriff Blackwood and 3 deputies proceeded to the cabin, where they confronted Marie and Margaret with the found equipment. According to the sheriff's report, the twins acknowledged recognizing the items, claiming they had discovered the case 4 days earlier while gathering kindling. Marie, doing most of the speaking, explained that they had moved it to the ravine for safekeeping, intending to bring it to authorities when next they ventured into town. Their explanation came readily, without hesitation or contradiction between them, Blackwood wrote, delivered with such wide-eyed innocence that several members of the search party immediately accepted their account. The report concludes with Blackwood's private assessment. The Thornhill girls present a picture of harmless youth. Yet I cannot shake a growing unease. Too many lost souls have vanished in their vicinity, with the sisters always providing neat explanations that cannot be disproven. Sheriff Blackwood's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1921, reveals that he began conducting discreet surveillance of the Thornhill property following the surveyor's disappearance. Entries dated early May 1898 describe his observations from concealed positions in the surrounding forest, noting the twins' daily routines and occasional interactions with passing travelers. On May 15th, having confirmed through Martha Collins that the Thornhill girls were visiting the general store in Pine Fork, Blackwood seized the opportunity to examine their property more thoroughly. His official report, filed later but sealed until its recovery during the 1956 courthouse renovation, details his findings. Behind the main cabin, partially concealed by a dense stand of rhododendron bushes that appeared deliberately cultivated for screening, Blackwood discovered a patch of recently disturbed earth. What initially appeared to be a common root cellar, a standard feature of mountain homesteads used for food preservation, revealed itself upon closer inspection to be something far more sinister. Clearing away branches concealing the entrance, Blackwood found a sturdy trapdoor secured with an iron padlock. Finding the key hidden in a hollow beneath a nearby rock, he descended a set of earthen steps into darkness. His report describes a chamber roughly 8 feet by 12 feet. Its walls reinforced with timber supports and its earthen floor covered with straw matting. A lantern hanging from a ceiling beam provided illumination once lit, revealing the chamber's disturbing contents. Along one wall stood a rough workbench bearing various tools, including several knives of different sizes, a bone saw, and butchering implements. Shelves lining another wall held jars containing preserved substances Blackwood declined to identify specifically in his report, referring to them only as human remains in various stages of preservation. Most damning was a collection of personal effects neatly arranged in wooden crates. Dr. Hargrove's medical bag with his name stamped in leather, Edward Hutchinson's survey journal and personal effects, items belonging to at least 4 other individuals who had been reported missing. Most alarming to Blackwood was a set of crude but meticulously detailed anatomical drawings pinned to one wall, depicting human figures with specific areas marked as prime cuts, best for smoking, and suitable for stewing. Recognizing the enormity of his discovery, Blackwood carefully relocked the chamber and retreated without disturbing the evidence, determined to return with additional lawmen to apprehend the twins. Sheriff Blackwood returned to the Thornhill property on May 16, 1898, accompanied by 4 deputies and the county medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Parker. The official report indicates they arrived at 7:14 a.m., intending to catch the twins before they might begin their daily activities. Upon approaching the cabin, however, they found it silent and apparently abandoned. A thorough search confirmed that Marie and Margaret Thornhill had fled, taking minimal possessions but leaving behind clear evidence of hasty departure. The underground chamber remained exactly as Blackwood had found it the previous day, its grisly contents now examined and documented by Dr. Parker, whose clinical notes would later provide damning evidence at trial. While searching the main cabin, Deputy William Hayes discovered a loose floorboard beneath one of the beds. The hidden compartment contained a leather-bound ledger approximately 9 inches by 12 inches, its pages filled with neat handwriting that alternated between 2 distinct styles. The contents of this document, preserved in county archives, reveal the full horror of the Thornhill twins' activities. Beginning in November 1896, just 6 months after their parents' deaths, the ledger documents in clinical detail the processing of at least 11 individuals. Each entry follows the same format: the victim's name, physical description, date of arrival at the cabin, method of harvesting, usually involving drugged food or drink followed by throat cutting during sleep, and a disturbing inventory of the yield in terms of usable meat. The ledger includes precise valuations of each victim's personal belongings, from clothing to pocket watches to currency, alongside notations about how these items were repurposed or hidden. Most disturbing were entries describing serving special stew or preserved meats to subsequent travelers, with observations about their enjoyment of the meal. The twins categorized visitors into transients, suitable for harvesting, versus connected individuals, allowed to continue their journeys, based on whether anyone would likely search for them in status Esavlash Komsamarn 170os, but.com 70. The area. The final pages contain explicit calculations of profit, with the chilling conclusion that the meat enterprise yielded approximately 6 times more value than selling preserved fruits or handcrafts would have provided. Dr. Parker's examination of the underground chamber confirmed the ledger's accounts. With preserved human tissue in various stages of processing, found in sealed jars and a smokehouse arrangement in one corner, containing what he clinically described as long strips of cured human flesh, prepared in a manner consistent with traditional pork preservation methods common to the region. News of the discoveries at the Thornhill cabin spread through Harlan County with unprecedented speed. The Harlan Weekly Gazette's May 18th edition carried the headline, "Monstrous Deeds Uncovered. Twin Sisters Sought for Unspeakable Crimes," though the newspaper declined to print the most disturbing details, noting only that evidence suggests multiple travelers met their end at the hands of the seemingly innocent young women. Church records from Pine Fork indicate that the Sunday sermon on May 20th addressed the community's collective horror, with the pastor urging congregants to maintain faith in humanity despite this darkness in our midst. Initial shock and disbelief quickly gave way to determination as Sheriff Blackwood organized what county records describe as the most extensive manhunt in Harlan County history. Deputizing an additional 58 men beyond his usual force, Blackwood divided the searchers into 12 teams, each assigned to specific sectors of the mountainous terrain surrounding the Thornhill property. The sheriff's logbook details the systematic approach, with daily reports from each search party as they explored caves, abandoned mining shafts, remote hollows, and dense forest thickets. The pursuit proved extraordinarily difficult, despite the resources committed. The twins' intimate knowledge of the local terrain gave them a significant advantage, and the vast wilderness offered countless potential hiding places. Tracking dogs lost scent trails at stream crossings, suggesting the girls had waded through water to confuse pursuers. For 3 grueling weeks, the search continued without success, expanding outward from the original property in an ever-widening circle. Then, on June 7th, a promising lead emerged from Limestone Gap, a small settlement approximately 30 miles northwest of the Thornhill cabin. A storekeeper named Abigail Wilson reported that 2 young women matching the twins' description had purchased supplies 3 days earlier, traveling in the company of a fabric merchant named Thomas Barlow, who regularly traversed the region selling his wares. Wilson's statement noted that the girls spoke with refined manners inconsistent with their rough appearance, and had mentioned plans to accompany Barlow to larger markets near the Ohio River. Sheriff Blackwood immediately redirected the manhunt northwestward, sending telegrams to authorities in counties along the likely route to the river. His message, preserved in county records, conveyed the urgency: murderous twins, likely heading toward Ohio border. Apprehend immediately. Extremely dangerous despite youthful appearance. May have claimed additional victim in Merchant Barlow. By mid-June 1898, evidence confirmed that the Thornhill twins had successfully crossed into Ohio. The body of Thomas Barlow, the fabric merchant last seen traveling with the sisters, was discovered on June 14th in a shallow grave near the river crossing at Catlettsburg. The coroner's report, transmitted to Sheriff Blackwood via telegraph, indicated that Barlow's throat had been cut with methodical precision, consistent with the techniques described in the Thornhill ledger. His wagon and considerable inventory of fabrics and notions were missing, along with his money and personal identification papers. Kentucky authorities immediately contacted their Ohio counterparts, sharing the gruesome details of the Thornhill case through official channels. Telegrams preserved in police archives show the information spreading northward through Ohio jurisdictions, accompanied by descriptions of the twins and warnings about their dangerous nature despite their youth. The Cincinnati Enquirer published a front-page story on June 17th titled "Murderous Mountain Twins," Beware these innocent faces, including sketches of Marie and Margaret based on descriptions provided by former neighbors and classmates from Pine Fork. The article detailed the horrific discoveries at their cabin, though editors softened some of the most disturbing elements regarding cannibalism, referring only to unspeakable treatment of victims' remains. This publicity generated immediate response from the public, with police logs from multiple Ohio jurisdictions recording dozens of reported sightings within the first 48 hours after publication. Many of these reports proved false, as witnesses mistook any pair of young women for the fugitives, creating considerable confusion for investigators. Meanwhile, a more methodical investigation proceeded as Sheriff Blackwood coordinated with Ohio authorities to track the movement of Barlow's distinctive wagon, described as having unique hand-painted decorative elements on its side panels. Confirmed sightings placed the vehicle in 3 small towns along the Ohio River between June 15th and June 22nd, moving steadily northward. Most significantly, witnesses in these locations described the twins as presenting themselves as Sarah and Elizabeth Barlow, daughters of the merchant, explaining that their father was conducting business elsewhere and had entrusted them with selling portions of his inventory to specific customers. Local merchants who purchased fabrics from the girls reported that they conducted business with surprising sophistication for their apparent age, maintaining detailed sales records and negotiating prices with confidence that belied their youth and the heinous circumstances of their journey. The Riverside Boarding House in New Brighton, Pennsylvania, a small manufacturing town situated near the Ohio border, catered primarily to respectable working women employed by the growing textile industry. Its proprietress, Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a widow who had operated the establishment since her husband's death in 1891, prided herself on maintaining high standards and carefully screening potential residents. Her personal journal, later donated to the Beaver County Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1935, records that on the 23rd of July 1898, she accepted 2 new boarders, who introduced themselves as Catherine and Elizabeth Wilson, sisters recently orphaned following their parents' deaths in a house fire in southern Ohio. Mrs. Whitaker's initial impression, recorded that evening, noted the young women's remarkably refined manners and vocabulary that suggest education beyond what might be expected from their apparent circumstances. She described them as nearly identical in appearance, though one speaks with more authority, while the other observes more carefully. The sisters explained they had come to New Brighton seeking employment in the textile mills, having some experience with sewing and fabric work. They paid for a month's lodging in advance with crisp new currency, which Mrs. Whitaker found noteworthy enough to mention. Her suspicions were first aroused 3 days later when she noticed discrepancies in their accounts of their background, with details about their deceased parents and former home changing subtly between conversations. On July 29th, Mrs. Whitaker's journal records a critical moment. While purchasing supplies in town, she noticed a week-old copy of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette featuring an article about the murderous mountain twins still being sought across multiple states. Though the accompanying sketches showed young women with different hairstyles and clothing, the facial resemblance to her new boarders was striking enough to cause immediate concern. Rather than confronting them directly, Mrs. Whitaker began observing the sisters more carefully, noting in her journal their habit of speaking to each other in whispers that ceased immediately when anyone approached. Their unusual interest in the comings and goings of the traveling salesmen who occasionally stayed at the establishment, and particularly their protective attitude toward a large trunk kept locked in their room. "They refuse laundry service or room cleaning unless they are present," she wrote on August 2nd. "And I have twice observed Catherine measuring the dimensions of the salesmen with her eyes while engaging them in seemingly innocent conversation about their travels." Mrs. Whitaker's journal entry for August 5th, 1898, reveals her growing anxiety about her boarders and her decision to act. After much prayer and consideration, I have dispatched young Thomas to deliver a sealed note to Sheriff Collins, detailing my suspicions regarding the Wilson sisters and their possible connection to the wanted Kentucky twins. May the Lord guide his swift return with assistance. Before any response from authorities could materialize, however, A critical incident occurred that evening. A traveling button and notion salesman named Frederick Palmer, who had taken a room at the boarding house 2 days prior, accepted an invitation to share evening tea with the Wilson sisters in the establishment's small parlor. Mrs. Whitaker observed this gathering briefly, noting in her account that Palmer appeared quite enchanted by the young women's attentive questions about his travels and merchandise. By morning, Palmer had vanished from the boarding house, his room undisturbed except for the absence of his personal effects and sample case. When Mrs. Whitaker knocked at the sisters' door to inquire if they had seen Palmer, she discovered them hastily packing their belongings, including the mysterious trunk that required both of them to lift. They explained with practiced smoothness that a telegram had arrived informing them of an employment opportunity in Pittsburgh that required immediate departure. The proprietress's suspicions now fully aroused, she engaged them in a deliberate conversation about train schedules and Pittsburgh accommodations, asking increasingly detailed questions while sending her 12-year-old son through the kitchen door with instructions to run for the sheriff. The official report filed later that day documents what happened next. Catherine Wilson suddenly interrupted Mrs. Whitaker mid-sentence, stating flatly, "She knows, Margaret. Look at her eyes." Without further warning, both young women produced knives concealed in their skirts and attacked the proprietress with shocking violence and practiced coordination. Mrs. Whitaker suffered deep lacerations to her face, neck, and hands before managing to overturn a heavy side table that momentarily blocked the twins' assault and allowed her to flee into the street, screaming for assistance. The sisters abandoned most of their belongings in their haste to escape through the rear entrance, disappearing into the warren of alleys behind the boarding house minutes before Sheriff Collins arrived. Though severely injured, requiring 27 stitches according to the physician's report, Mrs. Whitaker survived to provide authorities with crucial testimony, confirming that the Wilson sisters were indeed the fugitive Thornhill twins, and demonstrating firsthand the shocking speed with which they could transform from refined young ladies into efficient, vicious attackers. Employment records from the Hastings Garment Company in Philadelphia confirm that Elizabeth and Catherine Wilson began working as seamstresses on the 12th of September 1898. Their application forms, preserved in company archives, claim they had recently relocated from Pittsburgh following their parents' deaths, seeking new opportunities in Philadelphia's booming textile industry. Their supervisor, Harriet Daniels, later told investigators that the sisters demonstrated exceptional skill with needle and thread, producing work of remarkable precision and consistency. Tenement records show they rented a basement apartment at 1423 Carpenter Street, a modest accommodation in a working-class neighborhood populated primarily by factory workers and their families. Neighbors interviewed after subsequent events described the Wilson sisters as quiet but cordial, noting they attended Sunday services regularly at nearby St. Andrew's Church and occasionally participated in neighborhood gatherings. Their landlady, Mrs. Sophia Green, recalled them as model tenants who paid promptly and kept to themselves, though always polite in passing conversation. For nearly 5 months, the twins maintained this unremarkable existence, gradually integrating themselves into the community and earning the trust of those around them. The pattern shattered in February 1899, when young women from the Hastings factory began to disappear. Factory attendance records show that 3 workers vanished within a 4-week period: Mary Sullivan on February 3rd, Rebecca Klein on February 17th, and Judith Walsh on March 1st. All 3 women were last seen leaving their shifts at the factory and never arrived at their respective homes. Unlike the isolated travelers who had been the twins' previous victims, these women had substantial connections, families who immediately reported their absences, and communities that noticed their disappearance. Philadelphia police records show that Detective James Morrison initially investigated these cases as separate incidents, focusing on the women's male acquaintances and family members as potential suspects. Each disappearance generated substantial coverage in local newspapers, with the Philadelphia Inquirer running front-page stories questioning the safety of young working women in the city. The breakthrough came on March 7th when Detective Morrison happened to review bulletins from other jurisdictions while researching similar cases. The Kentucky Circular, describing the Thornhill twins, caught his attention, particularly the mention of their skill with needlework and ability to integrate into communities. Morrison noted in his case journal, the Wilson sisters at Hastings matched the general description of the Kentucky fugitives, allowing for different hairstyles and clothing. More telling, they arrived in the city approximately 6 weeks after the New Brighton incident, and the disappearances began after they had established themselves in the community. Philadelphia police records document that surveillance of the Wilson sisters began on March 8, 1899, with 2 officers assigned to observe their movements in rotating shifts. Detective Morrison's notes from March 10 describe suspicious late-night activities when the sisters were observed carrying heavy bundles from their basement apartment to a nearby alley for disposal during early morning hours, when few witnesses would be present. Officers recovered some of these discarded items, finding blood-stained rags and clothing fragments that heightened concerns. On March 15, while employment records confirmed the twins were at work at the Hastings factory, Detective Morrison led a team of 4 officers to search their basement apartment at 1423 Carpenter Street. The search warrant, preserved in municipal archives, authorized investigation based on reasonable suspicion of connection to recent disappearances. The landlady, Mrs. Green, confirmed that the apartment included a small adjoining room originally intended for coal storage, accessible through a door that the sisters had installed a new padlock upon shortly after moving in. Officers broke open this lock and discovered a meticulously organized space that Morrison's official report described as a processing chamber virtually identical in function to that documented in the Kentucky case. The room contained personal effects clearly belonging to the missing factory workers. Mary Sullivan's distinctive cameo brooch, Rebecca Klein's prayer book with family inscriptions, and Judith Walsh's monogrammed handkerchiefs. Shelving along one wall held glass jars containing preserved human tissue, labeled with dates corresponding to the disappearances. Most damning was a leather-bound ledger discovered beneath a loose floorboard, continuing the documentation style described in the Kentucky reports. The new journal contained entries for 4 victims, including the 3 missing factory workers and a previously unreported transient woman named Sarah Jenkins. Each entry detailed the yield in precise measurements, with notes on preservation methods and quality assessments. Detective Morrison immediately established a trap, positioning 6 officers in and around the building to apprehend the twins when they returned from their work shift at 6 p.m. Factory records show that both sisters left work as usual at 5:30 p.m., but they never arrived at their apartment. The police theory, noted in subsequent reports, suggests the twins may have observed the unusual police presence in their neighborhood, or perhaps had established a warning system with neighbors. A citywide alert was issued by 8 p.m., including distribution of updated descriptions to transportation hubs, but initial search efforts proved fruitless. The detailed police inventory of the apartment confirmed the sisters had fled without returning for their possessions, leaving behind clothing, personal items, and most significantly, their documentation of murders spanning multiple states. Public fascination with the Thornhill case reached unprecedented levels by late March 1899, with newspapers nationwide carrying sensationalized accounts of the killer twins. The New York Times ran a front-page Sunday feature titled "Murderous Sisters, A Tale of Deception and Cannibalism," while the Chicago Tribune published a series of illustrated speculations about the twins' origins and motivations. These popular accounts often embellished the already disturbing facts, portraying the sisters alternately as victims of circumstance or as inherently evil manifestations of humanity's darkest impulses. Amid this sensationalism, a more scholarly assessment emerged when Dr. James Pritchard, professor of neurology at Jefferson Medical College and consultant to the Philadelphia Police Department, published an analysis in the April 1899 edition of the Medical Journal of Philadelphia. Pritchard had examined both the Kentucky evidence and the Philadelphia crime scene, including the ledgers with their meticulous documentation of murders. His article, titled "Shared Psychopathology in Identical Twins: The Thornhill Case Study," represented one of the earliest attempts at psychological profiling of serial murderers. Pritchard wrote, "The evidence suggests these young women were subjected to severe trauma or unusual conditioning during their formative years, prior to their appearance in Kentucky. The ritualistic elements of their killings, particularly the methodical record-keeping and categorization of victims, indicates a learned behavior rather than spontaneous deviance. He noted that the twins' ability to function normally in society between murders, establishing themselves in communities and gaining the trust of neighbors and employers, demonstrated an exceptional compartmentalization of psychopathology that allows for situational normality. Most significant was Pritchard's analysis of how the twins' identical nature and isolated upbringing may have created what he termed folie à deux magnifiée, or magnified shared madness. Unlike typical cases where one individual influences another toward pathological behavior, he wrote, these identical twins appear to function as mirrors, each reflecting and amplifying the other's deviant impulses while simultaneously providing mutual justification for their actions. This psychological reinforcement, combined with their isolated upbringing and possible childhood trauma, created what Pritchard described as a closed system of morality entirely separate from societal norms. While primitive by modern standards, Pritchard's analysis represented a pioneering effort to understand serial killers as products of both biological predisposition and environmental conditioning, a perspective that would not become mainstream in criminology for another half-century. On the 11th of May, 1899, a hunter named Josiah Blackburn was tracking deer in the remote Allegheny Mountains of Tucker County, West Virginia, when he discovered an isolated cabin in a narrow valley, approximately 20 miles from the nearest settlement. Blackburn's sworn statement to local authorities describes finding the structure unoccupied but showing signs of recent habitation, including still warm ashes in the fireplace and fresh food in a storage bin. Most disturbing was his discovery of blood-stained implements in a lean-to attached to the main structure, prompting his immediate return to the nearest town to alert the sheriff. Blackburn's report eventually reached investigators still searching for the Thornhill twins, resulting in a joint expedition to the site. Official records show that on May 17th, a party including lawmen from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia converged on the cabin, accompanied by Dr. Parker, the medical examiner from the original Kentucky investigation. The expedition's findings, documented in a report signed by representatives from all three jurisdictions, confirmed their worst fears. The isolated cabin served as another killing ground, bearing the twins' distinctive methodological signatures. Physical evidence suggested the girls had occupied the site for approximately 2 months, from mid-March until early May 1899, corresponding with their disappearance from Philadelphia. The lean-to structure had been converted into what Dr. Parker described as a processing facility virtually identical to those found in Kentucky and Philadelphia, containing specialized tools, preservation equipment, and, most alarmingly, human remains in various stages of preparation. Personal effects recovered from the site suggested at least 3 victims: a male itinerant worker, identifiable through documents in his coat pocket, a female herb gatherer known to local residents, and a young man whose connection to the area remained undetermined. Among the items recovered was a partial journal written in Margaret Thornhill's distinctive handwriting, water-damaged but partially legible. The preserved pages, photographed and included in the official evidence file, reveal disturbing insights into the twins' belief system. Margaret wrote of categorizing victims as either mere meat, apparently selected solely for consumption, or worthy vessels, who received the honor of special treatment during the killing process. Most unsettling were passages referencing the family tradition and the sacred recipe passed down, suggesting the twins' activities may have had deeper roots than previously suspected. One partially legible entry reads, "Mother always said the preparation was as important as the harvest. Father taught us to select carefully, just as his father taught him. We honor them by maintaining the purity of the tradition." These writings raised disturbing possibilities about the twins' parents and their influence on the girls' development, suggesting patterns of behavior potentially extending across generations. On August 7, 1899, Thomas Jenkins, proprietor of a general store in Elk Mills near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, recognized 2 young women purchasing supplies as the fugitive Thornhill twins, despite their altered appearance. Jenkins maintained composure while serving the sisters, then immediately notified the town constable after they departed. By nightfall, law enforcement officers had surrounded the modest boarding house where the young women had taken rooms 3 days earlier under the names Ruth and Rebecca Sanders. The official report describes a carefully planned operation to apprehend the twins with minimal risk to the public. At approximately 10:15 p.m., officers simultaneously entered through all doorways, with specific teams assigned to secure the sisters' second-floor room. The twins, apparently alerted by the commotion, were fully dressed and armed when officers breached their door. What followed was described by Sergeant William Hayes as a whirlwind of violence executed with frightening coordination. Both sisters produced concealed knives and attacked with what multiple witnesses characterized as inhuman ferocity. Marie Thornhill lunged at Deputy Marshal Thomas Richardson, slashing his face before being fatally shot by Officer James Wilson. The coroner's report indicates she died instantly from a bullet wound to the chest. Margaret was subdued after a desperate struggle that left 3 officers with serious knife wounds. The psychological impact of witnessing her sister's death manifested immediately in Margaret's behavior. Prison physician notes document her rapidly deteriorating mental state as she alternated between prolonged periods of catatonic silence and frenzied outbursts, during which she spoke in what multiple witnesses described as 2 distinct voices, as though carrying on both sides of a conversation. During formal interrogation on August 12th, conducted in the presence of legal authorities and medical professionals, Margaret provided disturbing insights into the twins' relationship. Court transcripts record her claiming, "Marie was the hunger and I was the method. She felt the need. I planned the feeding. Together, we were complete." When pressed about the extensive list of victims now attributed to the sisters across 4 states, Margaret showed no remorse, stating with unsettling calmness that some people are born to be consumed, just as some are born to do the consuming. We recognized our purpose and embraced it fully. Margaret Thornhill was extradited to Kentucky in September 1899, where authorities had assembled the strongest evidence against the twins. Court records show her trial began on November 7th in the Harlan County Courthouse, becoming an immediate sensation that drew journalists from across the nation. The New York Herald devoted its entire front page to the proceedings on November 10th, featuring illustrations of the defendant and questioning whether a woman of such youth and apparent refinement could truly be responsible for the gruesome acts described in testimony. Margaret remained largely silent throughout the trial, refusing to cooperate with her court-appointed attorney and showing no visible reaction as witnesses detailed the evidence found at the various crime scenes. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on November 23rd. Judge William Harrington sentenced her to death by hanging, making her one of the youngest women in American history to face capital punishment. The execution was scheduled for January 15th, 1900, but would never occur. On December 27th, 1,899 prison guards discovered Margaret dead in her cell, having fashioned a noose from torn bedsheets. A final journal entry, written on smuggled paper and discovered beneath her mattress, read simply, "Without Marie, the hunger consumes itself." Public interest in the Thornhill case faded with surprising speed in the early 1900s as America entered a new century preoccupied with rapid industrialization and social change. The horror of the twins' actions contradicted comfortable narratives about rural innocence and female gentility, making it a story many preferred to forget. Official records were sealed or mysteriously lost in subsequent decades, contributing to the case's relative obscurity in mainstream historical accounts. The story might have disappeared entirely if not for Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a researcher from the University of Kentucky who discovered the original case files during a Harlan courthouse renovation in 1967. Her subsequent publication, The Thornhill Sisters, America's Forgotten Female Killers, brought the case briefly back to public attention. Modern criminologists now study the Thornhills as an early documented example of female serial killers operating as a team, noting the twins' methodology demonstrated unusual adaptability as they transitioned from opportunistic killings of isolated travelers to targeted selection of urban factory workers. The original Appalachian cabin has long since returned to wilderness, but local folklore preserves distorted versions of the story, warning children about the hungry sisters, who might still be waiting in the mountains for unwary travelers.